Good afternoon. First of all, thanks ever so much for bringing in the Intellectual Property Office into this forum. It's critically important for us, and I think it's only relatively recently that the IP part of the business of e-crime has been recognised. But it's very important, and we're very glad to be able to present to you. I'll just start by describing what we mean by intellectual property rights patent, which you need to apply for. And dealing with breaches and infringement, we go to civil law. Design is by application, which again is civil law. And then in trademark, which is by application, we've got a mixture of civil and criminal law. Copyright, which is intrinsic right, is a mixture of civil and criminal law. And the agency dealing with that is the Intellectual Property Office. Most of you know it as the Patent Office, which is an operating name for, the IPO is an operating name for it. And we're an executive agency under the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. So we're a civil service department dealing with the granting and examination of patent design and registering trademarks. So that's the key function, the patent marks and the design examiners who actually consider and issue those things. It's got a quasi-judicial adjudication role. It manages legislation, and which is a very complex, both domestic and the international framework. So you've got the umbrella of the World Trade Organisation, you've got European legislation, domestic legislation. And interestingly, we coordinate efforts to deal with intellectual property crime. It's a very complex landscape out there to deal with IP crime. At the borders, we've got the UK agency, but Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue, which is a national organisation, have the operational intelligence lead for alcohol and tobacco, which will be treated, whether it's counterfeit or not, will be treated as an excise offence, but it has the policy role for dealing with the borders. Trading Standards, a very local organisation, some 196, with inland responsibility for counterfeiting and piracy enforcement, but that's not their only day job. They have lots of other roles and responsibilities as well. The police from time to time are local, but not quite as local as the trading standards. No defined responsibility to deal with IP rights, but under UK legislation, particularly proceeds of crime, counterfeiting is what's called a Schedule 2 criminal lifestyle offence. Now, it's not a Schedule 2 offence because it's a trivial, it's a serious offence and it's taken seriously, which means that the assets gained through the criminality will be deemed lifestyle. And that's an important and interesting point to engage the police through it. I don't think another subject cross-cuts different areas, e-crime for one, but it cuts fraud. There's an intrinsic fraud in every counterfeiting job. It's a fake. It's not a real product, whether it's online or offline. So there is an interest in fraud, and the taxonomy of fraud, rather frightening actually, it's huge. When you look at all the different types of fraud, and IP rights is one of those, you wouldn't go out for fear of being conned, let alone mugged. And the City of London have taken a real interest in that from the national lead. So we're in fraud, we're in e-crime, but we're also in serious and organised crime, because there's beyond anecdotal evidence that serious and organised crime are involved in IP crime. And anecdotally, that would be that it's a fairly low risk, high return activity to be involved in. So not only people, criminals choosing to be involved directly, they're moving from other types of criminal activity. We've got Medicines and Healthcare Regulation Authority, a national organisation, but it has an investigative and prosecution role dealing with pharmaceuticals. And just the scale and nature of that problem are quite intense. And of course, serious public health issues arising from medicines made in all sorts of uncontrolled environments, medicines with things in them that are toxic, and medicines saying things that they do things that they don't. And very interestingly, I don't think there's another area of criminality that has such an investment made by the industry suffering the consequences of the crime against it, that's invested in its investigative capability. And that arises out of the general rule that brand holders are required to make a significant contribution to protecting their rights and into the enforcement. And that's resulted in of very capable industry investigative resources. So, if anything else needs doing, coordination of all that. So how do we do that in the UK? Well, we've got a national IP crime group where all these diverse interests come round the table. And that's chaired by Giles York, who used to be the Assistant Chief Constable in South Wales. He's now the Deputy in Sussex. And for over 7 years has kept that group together. And it really is quite a struggle because there are diverse views on how those things work and what should be important. But we produce an annual IP crime report, critically important document because that sets out what we think it looks like, tastes like and feels like. And out of that comes a government IP strategy. And it won't surprise you that the key elements of our government IP strategy this year are that we've got to get a better grip on the nature, the scale, the harm and the impact, because that's not an easy thing to identify, and there are different views on that. That we've got to work smarter, we've got to work in better ways, and we're not just looking at prosecution, we're looking at ways of disrupting the market in a sustainable way that's proportionate and that meets those diverse needs, particularly when you come to differing views on what can and can't happen online. So what's our priorities? Well, clearly anything that's harmful, particularly pharmaceuticals, alcohol and tobacco and electrical goods, some of the horror stories that you hear with electrical goods, which are sold to the less aware and the more vulnerable in society, who can be easily guided towards something not just on price but on its looks, but end up with a dangerous product. The audio-digital media, just the scale of the infringement on pirated goods is unbelievable. But consumer rights, and there's a real issue here, you know, consumer rights are hard won in this country, but reasonably effective. When you buy a fake, they're gone. You've got no way of seeing your consumer rights met when you're involved in buying counterfeits, whether that's knowingly or otherwise. And there are lots of cases where people felt that they were getting the genuine document but were led up the garden path. They ended up with something that's not worth the money they paid for it, and they've no avenue of redress. And that's a serious issue, particularly in hard times. But there are other economic harms too, to rights holders and to the revenue, and all sorts of examples where, particularly, for example, in alcohol and tobacco, where that is a clear loss to the revenue. We can't afford losses to the revenue in this time and age, but the rights holders will. And whilst there may be some debate on the actual figures, there is no doubt that industry and people who are entitled to the return on those intellectual property rights are having them stolen, and that has an impact on the income, has an impact on their viability, has an impact on the ability for them to secure and maintain jobs. And of course, serious and organised crime. An interesting survey and links into our ability to influence people. A YouGov survey, if people were aware that they were buying a fake and that would benefit serious and organised crime directly, a significant number of people said they wouldn't. But an equally significant, some 40% of people said they would think again. So what this means is in our enforcement menu of options, influencing people and using that ability for people to make choices away from it is a critically important element. So what are the challenges then? Well, an evidence-led assessment of scale, harm and impact of IP crime. We recently had a very important report done by Professor Hargreaves from Cardiff University on intellectual property in the UK. And it was fairly clear that it didn't accept current assessments of IP crime. Trying to get that accurate measurement is a real challenge, and I'm currently leading a project in the UK to come up with some method that's both practical in terms of cost, because sure, we would get it if we spent millions and millions of pounds collecting lots and lots of data to come up with an answer that would tell us it's in this ballpark figure. We need resources to format and analyse that, and a range of measurements. So I believe we won't come up with one single measurement, but we'll come up with a range of indicators that will tell us the right nature and scale and the right a reasonable assessment and a consensual assessment of just what the scale is so that we can properly influence policy and prioritisation. But whatever that figure might be, whether it's 65 million, 65 billion, 125 million, all will be quoted. None of that's a reason not to get on with dealing with IP crime now. And things that we're able to talk about and deal with at the moment, we probably weren't able to deal with last year because those issues weren't accepted. An awful lot has happened in the past year. So if we look at the physical markets, we're organised by having a national markets group, which consists of the private and public sector, and it deals with those three elements. Intelligence. Have we got good intelligence? And does that intelligence tell us the right places that we should be operating? What are our range of enforcement options? Some of those will be covert surveillance and following people and doing all sorts of test purchases. Some of them will be straight confrontation. Some of them will be dealing with the facilitation. If it's the security guards that are completely involved, they're licensed. Is there a way of disrupting through influencing that licensing structure? And then the prevention. In the UK, we have a Real Deal campaign that provides really good support to dealing with fake free markets. At the moment, we've got no benchmarks on these. We don't know what works and what doesn't work, but we've got that in hands where we can measure what kind of availability there is at the moment. After a series of interventions, both supportive, both directed at prosecution, is that availability the same? Has it gone down or has it increased? So that we can then start to get some best practice spread around. Now, online, we've created a similar structure. Not as robust as it's going to be, but that's because we brought together an awful lot of people with diverse views on what's acceptable online. The bulk of the investigation and the patrolling online for IP work is done by the industry, and a huge investment has been made. It tends to work in different silos at the moment, but bringing that together is really important. There are good standards of those investigations. We're getting some agreed standards so that we can then have a range of options of intervention. At the moment, cease and desist. The Publishers Association, for example, through its various members, has issued some 130,000 cease and desist notices. So that means on occasions they've identified to a credible standard that they are infringing sites where copyrighted material is being improperly and illegally exchanged. Now, whilst the bulk of those might be peer-to-peer, one-to-one exchanges, at the top end of the scale, there are sites dedicated to illegally, improperly, and for profit stealing copyrighted material. At the moment, the new Digital Economy Act isn't fully enforced, and how that's going to come out now is a matter of subject of debate and development. I mentioned the Hargreaves report. So we're left with making the best of current legislation and seeing how they can work. So together with the industry, which did an investigation to an agreed standard, with the City of London police looking at that from a money laundering perspective, sites were identified that were using payment card systems. Now, most of those were Ukraine registered sites or Russian registered sites. So very little chance that we would get behind those and find out who's actually running them. But one of the things they needed was to get payments to those sites by Visa and MasterCard. So an approach was made to those, and through discussions about what kind of levers, particularly money laundering regulations, which the payment card services people felt they were vulnerable to, having been told to an evidence-based standard that these were infringing sites, those payment services have been withdrawn. Now that's a real problem for the criminal. No prosecution here, no court order, but through an agreement and use of legislation by the adoption of proper standards, we're able to take away something that's vital to criminals. And there are a number of other options that we can use. I was able to meet with the two ministers involved, Baroness Wilcox for IP crime, and Ms. Ed Vaizey, who's responsible for the Digital Economy Act, with the advertising industry. No genuine advertiser and no genuine brand wants to have their brand represented on a site that's infringing IP rights. That's not good business. Plus the fact they're going to be the next victims. What's the possibility that we can come up with a system where advertisers are steered away from infringing sites so that that revenue stream to the site owner is removed? Well, it's all possible. And it's all possible using current legislation, current coordination, and ensuring that the standards and the criteria for identifying infringing sites are met. And there's a number of other areas. We've got court cases now that indicate that there is some level of accountability and responsibility by service providers, whether it be an auction site, whether that be an ISP. So where's the room for negotiation that? And using those structures I've described to you, we'll come up with ways of managing that and reducing the opportunity for criminals to profit, whilst not restricting the ability for people to operate. And I suppose really it's about breaking down the criminality into its stages. And you know, I've done it here for hard goods, but there are exact analogies online. So they've got to produce, they've got to manufacture, they've got to obtain the thing to copy. It's going to be imported or moved over borders, whether that's physical or whether that's through electronic means. It's going to be stored, it's going to be reworked, it's going to be distributed, it's going to be sold. And now each of those have got areas where if we've got good intelligence, we've got well-coordinated activity, we can disrupt and we can make sure that life's more difficult in order for criminals to profit out of the honest business. And what are those enablers and facilitators? I mentioned the payment card services. Do they use accommodation addresses? Well, yes, they do. So can we concentrate on dealing with those elements that will make life that much harder for criminals to profit from the theft of IP rights? And then ultimately, there are offender management tools beyond sending them to prison, like serious crime prevention orders, where people are persistently and consistently, whatever intervention, whatever punishment, carry on doing those. The courts have the ability on application of the prosecution to put in some prohibitions or requirements longer term. So what have we got to do? Cross-sector objectives, we need quality intelligence. That means coordinating through all those different silos, all those different pots. And that's why we've got this unusual intelligence capability sitting across all those within the Intellectual Property Office. We've got to identify what's prioritised at local level, what is important, you know, what are the community safety issues in relation to markets that are selling high counterfeits. What are, for example, in Wales, a cursory examination, we see a rather high incidence of people using auction sites on an individual basis to sell counterfeit goods. What's the nature of that problem? How can we coordinate with all the different bodies involved so that we can come up with a range of interventions? And then regionally, nationally, and of course, by its very nature, counterfeiting and anything on the internet crosses national borders with ease. What can we do to disrupt those facilitators? If we have a high incidence of unmarked counterfeit goods coming in and labels coming in separately, what does that mean? That means those being reworked somewhere. So if it's counterfeit goods, if it's being reworked somewhere in a factory, what kind of factory would that be? It's not going to be a nice, clean, enterprise-related factory on an industrial estate paying more than the minimum wage. It's going to be a sweatshop. Who else is interested in sweatshops? Well, there's gangmaster legislation in this country. There's a human trafficking issue, which we're well aware of in this country. And it's up to us to make sure that we tie up across those disciplines to intervene in the most effective way. But most importantly is the recovery of assets. Because if there's no money in it, there's no motivation. And we've got the legislation to deal with that. And we've got to get good at identifying how that goes. And there's some magnificent work being done. One of the largest confiscations was conducted by a Trading Standards Office. Over £11 million of criminal assets were recovered and confiscated by the court last year. just recently, £750,000 from a counterfeiter importing and selling counterfeit golf clubs. That's work done in isolated pods. Our challenge and our job is to tie that all up. It's to tie it into the threats that you see. A lot of the issues have been about access to your personal data. The other side of our business that I want to emphasise to you, and it's particularly important with the nature and scale of small, medium enterprises in South Wales, is that those rights are valuable. You know your assets, the assets in your physical assets that you've got, the trade that you turn over, the staff that you've got. How many of you know the value of the intellectual property rights that you have? And how many of you are familiar with getting those rights recorded, getting those rights registered, and making sure that should there be an infringement, you've got access to the right routes in order to deal with them? It's critically important because our only way out of this recession is through innovation. And innovation means that those IP rights have got to be recognised and should be protected. And that the IPO is there to make sure that you can do that and that they're supported. So I've talked about the criminal side of things, the need for coordination. On the civil side of things, it can be quite daunting to undertake any process. With that in mind, the IPO and the Ministry of Justice lead, have introduced a more refined and easy access to the Patents County Court, where claims of less than £5,000 are allocated. There are informal hearings, and there are strict limits on the costs that were involved, which makes it much more accessible to enforce your rights. I know a big fear among many people is that if my rights are protected and they are infringed, I could be getting myself into a situation where it's way too expensive in order to enforce them. Well, to ameliorate that, the small IP claims track has been created and opens the door to it. Some other issues, we've brought guides to prosecutors to try and demystify offences. IP infringement in the workplace. A guide has gone out. How many people know of the person who brings round fake DVDs and sells them to their workmates? Is that acceptable? No, it's not. But how to deal with IP infringement in the workplace? The business software that's being misused. All those different areas of misuse of IP in the workplace is now being put into a very, very good guide. A number of other initiatives that are going on there to try and deal with that range of issues and that range of interventions. That finishes my bit of the presentation. Some really interesting bits and some compare and contrast with the American side of things. And you'll see some interesting stuff there. And of course, my colleague from the film industry. Thank you.